Greetings, fellow nerds, and welcome to another episode of Between Two Nerds. I'm Jeff Doyle, and with me, as always, is my friend and co-host, the notorious BGP, Jeff Tansura. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff. Great to see you, as
Good
always.
to see you too.
Hey,
How's
everyone.
everything been with you?
Life is exciting. A lot of
Yeah.
stuff is going on. You know, suddenly size of ML clusters is going from tens and hundreds to tens of thousands. So really exciting time for networking.
Yeah. And speaking of exciting times for networking, maybe future of networking and that sort of thing, which it seems like we've focused a lot on that in, different views in talking about the role of AI in networking and quantum internet and that sort of thing. And would you describe our topic today as being still the future of networking, or is this something that's becoming fairly established?
It's one of the possible directions, right? I think we all agree that leaf-spine topologies are very universal, have very nice properties, equidistancy. However, they come with cost associated, and people are looking around for different topologies. And when we say topology, we are talking about really physical connectivity between different elements.
Yeah.
And today's show is really investigation of what can be done with notorious BGP and today's technologies in non-shortest. So the one of the most significant difficulties in non-short path topologies, your routing protocol need to be able to compute not only the shortest path, but
Mhm.
non-shortest path to it. You also need to figure out when do you move traffic from shortest path to non-shortest path. So for example, there's a failure, right? So none of this is really supported in current routing protocols. You can make them work, and our guest is going to exactly explain how you use the notorious protocol to do this with some configuration tweaks.
Yeah.
Practically, it's a well-known problem. The optimization in non-short path topologies is well-known problem, been in the industry for many, many years. And if you look at how a lot of silicon systems are built, they follow same paradigm in a way.
Yeah.
Pretty much all modern switches are built like a leaf spine inside.
Hmm.
If you look how silicon is put on a die, very often it's a Dragonfly or similar topology or hypercube, right? So it's not really new, and economics allow you to do this pretty easy when you're on constrained space. Doing it at scale and data center is a very different problem because your cabling is different, your
Hmm.
relationship is different, and again, you've introduced topologies that's not equidistant. So distance between two endpoints not necessarily the same depending on path you are taking. And there's a lot of complexity from operational perspective, from really deployment perspective. And if you look how large data centers are built, it's not
Yeah.
like someone shipping racks and then someone coming and cabling them. All the stuff comes from very far place,
Yeah.
completely pre-cabled, pre-racked. So you just need to power it up, right? So if your physical layoff is different, it's years of work to change it.
So when we're talking about Dragonfly topologies and adaptive routing within those and that sort of thing, are we talking specifically about HPC, high performance compute data centers, or does this apply? Maybe this is a good question for our guest, but does this have implications for other data centers too, or is it really an HPC environment that we're?
So I would like to completely separate HPC and ML. It's very common confusion to put
Okay.
them together.
Yeah.
HPC has completely different properties, have pretty much nothing to do with ML clusters, not from uh, not from packet size perspective, not from topology needs,
Mhm.
especially sensitivity to latency. Right, HPC is
Yeah.
extremely sensitive to latency and packet loss. Uh,
Mhm.
LLMs, for example, as long as latency is the same, they don't really care when you're a bit slower. I mean, not slow, but slower, right? So
Yeah.
the characteristics for this type of network are completely different, and we should not be mixing them.
Okay.
And I think it's a good time to invite our guest.
Just going to
friend
suggest
of the show, personal friend, and we are really glad to see Dima again here with us.
Hi, Dima. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. So you discussed.
So I'll be short intro for people who don't know you. Dima is the architect at Yandex, where he works on anything and everything at scale. Spend a lot of time on machine learning specific stuff. And today's presentation, there's also effort for this to at least educate IETF on what's going on in like machine learning focused clusters and data centers. So there is upcoming IETF drafts for routing working groups that describes what we are going to talk about today. And eventually there's more work that will go into it.
Yeah. So yeah, it's at least related to large clusters for machine learning, not only for them, but it's obviously related. And my impression is that in near future, most of the compute and significant amount of networking is just going to be in ML-related clusters, because more and more compute capacity is dedicated to ML.
Well, this is interesting to me because the question I asked about HPC and that sort of thing is, the academic papers that I've read on routing in Dragonfly topologies, which admittedly is not very many, mostly talks about supercomputers and HPC environments, and so. When Jeff was saying, well, ML is really separated from that, I didn't find that in any of the papers I read, and so I think maybe my knowledge of this might be a little limited. So I'm looking forward to.
So I would say
educated.
Networking machine learning cluster used to be kind of niche technology.
Yeah.
Just 4 months ago, before OpenAI published their stuff, right? So that's why you don't see a lot of stuff. It's very focused. It used to be very focused work for a very small group of people. A lot of them in academia or working for hyperscalers and not really talking about what they're doing. Now, suddenly, everyone is talking about it. We see, again, number of or size of models going exponentially. So we just saw GPT-3 coming with 175 billion parameters. GPT-4 is already over 1 trillion. And models like TN25, which is 25 trillion parameters. Think about this number, are coming, right? So
yeah,
networking suddenly is so important.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And as for HPC, it's actually a good point. My impression is that like HPC world is a good source of interesting ideas, and it explored a lot of interesting topologies. And what some people are trying to do now, including me, is to bring some of those ideas into IP, like familiar to almost everyone in networking IP Ethernet environment. Try to make them work, maybe with some limitations, but still, because we have some tools and there are some hacks, so we can make them work. Because HPC world is really a source of a lot of very interesting things, and obviously because it's very controlled environments, people were able to experiment a lot and to do things which are quite difficult to do when you have a standard based environment and cannot really change things or control every single part of it. So yeah, it's a source of a lot of interesting technologies. As for HPC and ML, yeah, they are very different. I agree with that, but I would say there are some common parts, because both HPC and ML can take advantage of collective operations, but packet sizes and objects they manipulate on are really different depending on the problem, because if you are solving something like partial differential equations on some fine mesh, it's a lot of short transfers. When we are dealing with machine learning training, it's usually very large vectors or tensors. So We are less concerned with efficiency of small transfers or really with latency, but more concerned with bandwidth. So yeah, there are significant differences as well. And of
And it
course,
might sound very
precision is
simple,
different. You're
but
not doing
eventually it will come down to very same set of problems we are trying to solve in IP networking. How do I do my CMP? In order for eCMP to work, you need large amount of small flows, right, to reasonably evenly distribute them across all hashing buckets. Now, if you've got 3-4 flows of terabit size, suddenly your entropy isn't working, right? So we will discuss kind of what's known as adaptive routing in industry in another show, but practically, when we are trying to do this in IP Ethernet, we are dealing with exactly the same set of problems. What happens when BGP goes down, right? So from network engineering perspective, set of problems is very similar. It just cost of failure is very different.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a good place to dive into. It's hard to say to the beginning because we've sort of got a good discussion going already. But for viewers that don't know, should we define Dragonfly networks first before we talk about routing within those networks?
Absolutely. And just one observation before we dive in and describe the topology and routing. One observation is that actually there are like two kinds of network. Of course, it's very rough classification, but there are networks which are used mostly to move data from point A to point B, and another class of networks which are used for computation, because you can your problem is so large you cannot fit it to one or two nodes. It's essentially distributed, and network is not really used to move data. It's used to interact with compute nodes. And in IP world, people were mostly dealing with moving bits, just moving for the sake of moving. And now we are dealing more and more with distributed computation. And that's another reason why there are a lot of things to borrow from HPC world, because HPC world from the beginning was about distributed computation.
Yeah, so probably another good point here, most of things we describe for machine learning are actually related to training, not to inference network. Inference networks are very different, and we are not going to really touch upon them.
Exactly. And there are good sources on the internet about traffic patterns of distributed training. For example, if I remember correctly, they were a good introduction at Hot Chips conference. So, you mean slides or?
Yeah. So
there we go.
Good. Good time to start. Yes.
Yeah. So, one more side note is why we are interested in some new topologies for data centers. And the reasons are basically trying to get network diameter smaller and latencies smaller, and also to make either network larger at the same cost or at the same size to make network cheaper. But what I see recently is that we are trying to make network larger. I mean, larger with the same number of switches and the same number of inter-switch links. Also, we would like to have more path diversity and more graceful degradation in presence of failures, because leaf-spine topologies fail not very gracefully, I would say, in some cases at least. There are a lot of ideas to borrow from HPC world, and specifically from HPC interconnects. And now they're slowly percolating, and we hope to accelerate that. They're percolating into IP Ethernet world. And the big problem is that we don't have the same degree of control and the same mechanisms for routing and forwarding, because we don't have like credits or virtual channels, and we don't really have proper adaptive routing. But it's possible to at least approximate some of those mechanisms. And finally, we have, I would say, minimum viable set of tools to make it Dragonfly topologies, for example, work. And yeah, here it's not visible, but it's actually linked to the presentation about network topologies for data centers, some history, and well, some good overview of history and motivation for different topologies for data centers. So when we're talking about advanced topologies, it's mostly from HPC world or from academic world, and it's a lot of research, including some very recent research, because almost every year at NSDI and SICOM you can see several talks about some new topologies or at least variations of topologies. And many of them are interesting, but most of them are not really deployable. And the reasons, some of them are quite difficult to expand or deploy incrementally. And if you are talking about data centers, to less degree HPC, but like hyperscale data centers, it's almost never that we deploy them from day one completely. It's usually we deploy some part of it and try to expand, and we want to be able to do that without too many issues. Another problem is complex wiring rules, because, for example, there is slim fly topology with very small diameter, very interesting, but wiring is so complex. I mean, it's not very regular. It only works for particular graph sizes and so on. So yeah, if you are not building complete system, but building something and going to expand it, it's probably not going to work. And some of those topologies are very irregular, and Jellyfish is the most notorious example because it's randomly wired graph. Still, some of those topologies are easier to make work than others. But common property, once again, to different degree, is that they require more complex routing and more complex forwarding than our traditional IP networks. First of all, they require non-minimal routing, because those topologies have a lot of capacity, but most of that capacity is along non-minimal paths. So if we cannot make use of non-minimal paths, we just have something with very small capacity, not interesting at all. Then we have more forwarding state, because there's less symmetry. There are a lot of non-minimal paths with different properties. And to make efficient use of that capacity, we need some form of adaptive routing, and we will talk about that later.
Dima, I think it would be useful for people if you define what non-minimal routing really was.
Yeah,
That's the same
well, thing. Yeah, actually, it will be easy to show later on the picture, but basically, if you use traditional IP routing, we will have shortest path. And obviously, there are other possible paths, but they could be longer. And in normal IP routing, they are not going to be installed in forwarding table.
Yeah.
But depending on topology, there could be a lot of capacity along those paths, and we want to be able to use that. So it just ability to forward along paths which are longer than shortest paths.
And to add to that, in the one we've been doing this all the way along, right? We would build a tunnel that's RCPT or any kind of administrative tooling like segment routing plus SDN controller, and kind of abstract notion of difference in the path length, because it's just entry point of the tunnel and exit point of the tunnel. We actually don't know what's in between, right? Yeah. And it works in the one because you change not very often. You re-optimize maybe once an hour. If there's a failure, you do fast reroute and then again re-optimization. In data center topologies, given number of links, the changes are instant. So building kind of source-based or tunnel-based routing, I'm yet to see this kind of solutions that can work at scale required.
Yeah, and it's both about number of links and about flows, because when we are talking about WAN, Usually we are talking about aggregate flows, which are like very fat, and on average, they don't change much.
Yeah.
Constituent flows change a lot, but aggregate flow is usually quite stable. It's not going to change on the order of seconds or tens of milliseconds. But in data centers, and especially distributed computations, it could be high speed but short-lived flows which change a lot and on the order of few round-trip times.
So if you fully centralize your kind of demand computation and provisioning, you'll be out of time even before the information actually reaches your controller.
Yeah, a controller is still useful to install some non-trivial forwarding state, for example, for those non-shortest paths, but adaptive routing is still required because you want to be able to like move flow from utilized paths to less utilized paths. That's what it is about. So topology is the same, set of discarded paths is the same, but you want to remap your traffic to the.
Yeah. And at some point in time, we'll come to talk about RDMA, which is de facto the technology we used in machine learning to move data, and how it works kind of in SDN-like scenarios with InfiniBand. But this is not for the show.
Yeah. So what is Dragonfly? Dragonfly is hierarchical topology, and it's made of several groups. Data center people probably more familiar with pods, and I'm going to use groups and pods interchangeably. And there's a full mesh between groups. And if we look at original Dragonfly paper, there could be any topology inside group. And different intra-group topologies, they produce like different flavors of Dragonfly. Main focus is that we want to reduce the number of long links, like intergroup links, with intergroup links. And when we are talking about paths, it's maximum 3 hops, 1 global between groups and 2 local. But once again, original Dragonfly, it's from HPC world. It's using virtual channels. So 1 hop could be more than 1 link. And that global hop can actually go through intermediate groups. You have a picture with that. And this topology has a lot of capacity via non-minimal paths and requires adaptive routing for efficient utilization. It will work without adaptive routing, just not very well.
So let's define adaptive routing, right? So it's not just
or
sure. Let me give it a try. So
yeah.
Normally, you would send all the traffic on the shortest path. In ECMP-like topology, normally you would load share across all ECMP paths because they're loop-free and have same distance to the destination. That's why they're actual.
But ECMP is assuming that you have, by definition, equal cost paths, right?
Exactly. So practically, you would try to distribute all the traffic between all paths eligible. And in order to avoid out of order, you would do it per flow. And flow could be 5 tuple, could be any tuple that represents a flow. So it's non-adaptive. It's very static in a way. You hash the keys or seeds. It results in particular, it yields particular hashing bucket, and then you send all the traffic over there, independently of size of the flow, speed of the flow. Usually you are not aware of egress capacity when you make this decision at ingress. So the load sharing decision is always done at ingress. So when you hit the ingress of the switch, right? So adaptive means that you can adapt to some particular conditions. Could be as simple as my interface is overloaded because unfortunately I hashed all the fat flows into the single link. So let me move some of them. This is commonly known as DLB. I mean, DLB is adaptive routing. It's just a vendor term, probably known if you are using Cisco or Juniper or maybe Arista. It could be as complicated as I really understand what kind of traffic this is. Some of this could be load share, some of it cannot be. So I could go and build something more granular than a flow, maybe flowlet. Maybe I'll do it per number of packets, and I know how to deal with out of order. Or maybe all my fabric is built on the same switches. I know exactly how they behave. So rather than treating it switch per switch, I can kind of treat it as a fabric of connected devices and understand how to load share traffic. So there are many different ways to do it. Practically, adaptability means you are not statically pushing traffic even if something bad is happening on the fabric. You're trying to adapt to changes in topology in real time.
Yeah, so there are like two types of adaptation. First, when you're doing initial flow placement, you are just trying to adapt to existing condition at that moment. And another adaptation, if situation changes over time, you are trying to remap your traffic to topology. And like there are commonly distinguished types like global adaptive routing and local adaptive routing. DOB is an example of local adaptive routing. Local means we are only using information available for local device, like egress queue utilization. And it's a good starting point for traffic placement, but it's not really enough, because it doesn't see anything beyond single hop. It only, well, a local queue utilization is not representative of global network state.
And just kind of to bring analogy, people familiar with an all good RSVP world, we had all the auto mesh, auto tunnel. The stuff was immensely complex. I think we've been fixing bugs for over 15 years here. This is just to show you how difficult it is to compute at scale demand, size of the tunnel, pretty much changing it in real time based on some conditions. It's a really complex problem when you try to do it globally.
Well, so going back to Dragonfly, this is a picture from original Dragonfly paper. So what we have is we have a number of groups, and there are routers in each group, and some of those routers are used as group uplinks, and we have a common pool of group uplinks, and we use those uplinks to connect groups to have a full mesh between groups. But what that means is that we don't necessarily, on particular router inside group, we don't necessarily have a link to particular other groups. We might have to use other router in that group. So that depends on how many, what is router radix and how many links we have. And once again, I will have some illustration later. Good property of Dragonfly is that it can scale very quickly with router radix. We can build really big networks with modest router radix. Like with 60 router radix, only we can build something like 100,000 nodes network. So it's growing really fast. And as I mentioned, when we are doing routing in Dragonfly, it's only 3 hops, but global hop can have some structure inside. It can go through intermediate groups. And then is Dragonfly Plus. It's a flavor of Dragonfly where intra-group topology is leaf spine. There is another name for it. It's there is a paper called Megafly. It's essentially the same topology. Different authors, same, more or less same topology, different name. And yeah, it's just leaf spine, nothing unusual here. We have leaves, we have spines, and hosts are connected to leaves. It's bipartite graph inside, and on spines there are uplinks, and there is a pool of uplinks for entire group, and we use it to connect group.
So practically, when you hear someone talking about Dragonfly today, probably 99% is going to be Dragonfly Plus.
Yeah, it's 99.9 probably. Because once again, if it's outside the HPC world, it's definitely Dragonfly Plus, and I'm less sure about what's in the HPC, but it's probably Dragonfly Plus as well. Because Leaf Spine is actually a very nice topology for a group, and Jeff already described that very nicely, and I have some notes on routing that. In our view of routing, what people are teach when they're doing some networking courses is that routing is about connectivity and reachability. But in real world, it's not only about reachability. You also want to have capacity. Moreover, there are cases when we probably just want to ignore some shortest paths because it's just doesn't have enough capacity. And if we go like one hop more, there's so much more capacity. So we are playing some tricks. And to achieve capacity, what we are doing is that we either trying to use graph symmetry and basically to make our topology appear very, very simple when in fact it's more complex. And that's where all the multipass things are coming from. Or to explicitly deal with many paths, including non-minimal, and it usually means more forward in state. Jeff also mentioned another solution where we are using some overlay topology tunnels, whatever, to make some symmetry overlay with high symmetry, which can use the ECMP on top of underlay, which is less symmetric.
And one might ask immediately, wait, IETF has built, or there's like 6 or 7 different RFCs on how to carry capacity in IGP and BGP, right? What people forget is so the trade-off is between how often do you do this versus how stable your topology is. And those of us old enough remember major meltdowns on network who enabled this capability for SVP computation. So naively, people said, anytime there's a change, just flood it in your IGP. Flooding your IGP obviously causes recomputation and reestablishment of all the tunnels. So just after a couple of days of deployment, I think it was like 30 years ago, so maybe 20, few networks just completely melt down just because no single device could deal with this amount of changes, and they're very computation intensive. And again, we are talking about a long time ago when routers had CPU that probably your phone today is 1,000 times more powerful. Right?
Yeah. It's kind of opposite to don't do it at home. It's okay to do it at home, just don't do it in production.
You know, I have a T-shirt. I test my code in production, so I'll wear it next time.
Yeah, and another problem with trying to distribute link utilization in routing protocols. It's a classical problem with control systems. If reaction time of your control system is much larger than characteristic time of parameter change for a system, you cannot control it, and you are going to have oscillations or meltdown or something. You are not really controlling it. You are doing something, but usually too late, and probably even making things worse.
Yep.
Yeah, and also another interesting thing about symmetries, especially if we are talking about large networks like large data centers, even if you build something with high degree of symmetry, it's not going to stay that way because things are going to break down. So any real world deployment should be able to deal with less than perfect symmetry and adapt to it, obviously. And once again, many interesting topology, basically anything interesting beyond multi-stage clause. is not symmetric enough to use ECMP, at least not directly. And even if we can tweak them or have some tricks to use them, ECMP by itself cannot provide efficient traffic placement. So back to Dragonfly pass again. Here are two, well, absolutely minimal Dragonflies. One on the left is where we have enough radix, so each leaf in each spine in each group has enough links to directly connect to a corresponding spine in another group. It's kind of dense mesh between groups. It's an easy kind of topology, but it doesn't scale as well as the topology on the right, where our spines don't have enough radix to connect to corresponding spine in each group. So we are using uplinks on another spines to connect to some groups. And on following slides, we'll see what kind of paths we have, depending on if we have dense mesh or sparse mesh between groups. And I'm going to use, once again, interchangeably terms like minimal or LGL. LGL means local, global, local, what types of link we are going to traverse. So here is what kind of minimal pass between couple of nodes we are talking about, minimal or LGL pass. Very simple. We start from some node, we load balance over spines. If every spine can go to the destination group, then go to the destination group and come to the destination node. But on the left, we can see that we cannot really load balance over spines because only one spine have direct link to destination group. So if you are going to use sparse mesh, then minimal pass is going to be much smaller. Then we have minimal plus one or LGGL, like local, global, local paths, which are going through some intermediate group. Once again, when we have a dense mesh, it's very simple. We are going through all the spines in the group and then load balance through many intermediate groups. If you have a sparse mesh, in this particular example, we have only one path which can go through intermediate groups. So once again, not very big set of paths. And then there are minimal plus 3 paths. We are not using minimal plus 2. Doesn't make sense because they would just traverse couple of intermediate groups and it totally doesn't make sense. But what those paths do, they go to some intermediate group, but because mesh between groups is sparse, in the intermediate group spine, ingress spine doesn't have direct link to destination group. So we have to reflect through leaves and go to different spine, egress spine, which in turn have direct link to destination group. And we can see that most of the capacity in that sparse mesh is actually through this type of paths, which are minimal plus 3 and going to use intermediate group and going to reflect where leaves. But this type of topology is the most scalable ones, but it's most difficult to deal with. And some properties that if you are talking about minimal plus 1, it's more or less nice type of path because distance to the destination at least don't increase along the path. There is one hop where it stays constant, but it's not going to increase, and it's a very nice property. It's relatively easy to make it work without source routing. But when we're talking about minimal plus 3, there is a hop where destination is going to increase, and it's very problematic. So it's kind of question because originally I saw that it's not going to be possible to do without some kind of source route and traffic engineering, but with introducing one additional transit VRF, it's still possible to do, but it's kind of complicated. And to make reasoning about Dragonfly topology a little bit easier, we can introduce planes, kind of similar to what we have in leaf span and multi-stage clause. Planes are between spines, not inside groups, it's between groups. And we can consider routing in each plane separately from another one, because we go to spine and then we are going to other groups, and that part of path, it kind of stays within the same plane. So what is the solution and how we can make this kind of topology work using only standard tools available for IP networks? We are using different separate VRFs for groups or pods and for the core or transit. And in the core, we are only going to use and install in the forwarding plane minimal paths. But in the group VRF or pod VRF, we are going to install minimal intragroup paths, and we are also going to ECMP. Google has had a couple of very interesting papers at SIGCOMM last year, essentially describing very similar kind of topology. It's kind of Dragonfly-like because it's less symmetrical. They are doing some capacity engineering with optical circuit switches, but essentially the same kind of topology. It's groups and more or less full mesh between groups, but it's not necessarily symmetrical full mesh. So what we are doing to make use of non-minimal paths, in the pod VRFs we install ECMP, which includes non-minimal paths. But in the core, we are only using minimal paths. How we can make that ECMP? When we import routes from the core into pods, we just either prepend IS for minimal paths to make IS path lengths equal for non-minimal and minimal, or just completely rewrite it. Both ways are possible. So when we are going from inside the group to the core, we have ECMP forwarding state. But if traffic comes from another spine and we are in transit group, this happens in core VRF, and we only have shortest path there. So that's the trick. It's actually quite simple. BGP has policies, and policies basically allow to implement additional logic which is not available in the original routing protocol. So what we do, if we using a few communities to essentially make counting. So we make a nonce from within group. When a nonce going out into the core, we add a community which marks it like it's the first announcement into the core. And then spines in another group can reflect it, but we are adding one more community which says it's the second announce within the core. So next time spines are not going to re-announce that into the core, but it still can be imported into the groups. And when we are importing paths into the group VRFs, we just make them equal from the point of view of forwarding state, so we can do ECMP. It's actually quite simple trick, and it works. But what about those minimal path 3 and LGOL and GL paths? Actually, it's possible to make them work. With the original setup, we only have two VRFs, one for transit or core and another one for each group. Problem is we cannot use group VRF for transit because it's doing ECMP. If you go inside that VRF for transit, it will load balance across all the other groups, and we will have loops. So solution is to introduce one more VRF, which is not used for egress from the group. It's only used for transit, and it imports only shortest paths. And once again, we are marking that with additional communities. to distinguish this type of path, and we can then import them in other groups. And any spine, if it has some better path, it's not going to announce this kind of path, but if it's the only one for particular destination, it's going to announce it. And once we have some basic discovery with some tricks and ECMP forwarding, what we have is that ECMP or weighted CMP are not really adequate to describe what we want to do, because we really don't want to do equal balancing across all the paths. What we would actually like to do is first use the shortest path while there's capacity over there. But when it's filled, use non-minimal paths, starting from shorter non-minimal paths, and later maybe going from shortest to minimal path 1 to minimal path 3. That's the idea, but ECMP semantics just doesn't allow to describe that. And also we are going to have load changes on the network, some of them happening very quickly. And that's another reason for having adaptive routing. There is another interesting thing happening here, because in highly symmetric topologies, usually spraying or per packet load balancing work very well. Well, if everybody is using per packet load balancing, you kind of have equal load and everything is very nice and symmetric and so on. But it doesn't work with adaptive routing, because adaptive routing needs some long-lived artifacts which you can address and move. And if you are doing per packet load balancing, there is nothing to, you don't have anything long-lived. So we really need flows.
So I would add to that. The per packet load balancing introduces out of order packets, and this is pretty much why, right? So most applications expect packets to be delivered in order. So if it's TCP, TCP will do reordering, but practically, given that in data centers that would potentially use this kind of technologies, 90% of the traffic, or probably 99.9% of traffic is UDP, it requires some additional functionality to put packets in order before giving them to applications, right? And it creates a lot of complexities. We will eventually discuss, because if you just naively say, you know what, I'm going to allocate gigs of buffer all the packets for, I don't know, 100 milliseconds and reorder them, you introduce latency. Your queue might actually grow boundly, and if your traffic is lossy or your network is lossy, and you lose a packet, you still don't know whether you lost it or just out of order. So the queue size is kind of unbounded. So from this perspective, it's really, really complex to find right solution. Yeah, it's not for this meeting, but or show. We'll discuss in more details at some point.
Yeah. If you have very good latency estimation for a network, it's possible to kind of make reasonably sized reassembly buffer to deal with your order, but it requires a lot of other things to delay. So difference between delay along different paths is not too big, and so on. So yeah.
So there's relatively old CCOM paper on flowlets from mostly Cisco people, I would think. In their assumption, if you use exactly the same switches that are connected at the same distance, same fiber, same optics, you can compute interpacket gap and safely load balance at kind of higher granularity than a flow, because you know exactly how long it's going to take from one switch to another, because they're the same. Practically, most networks are not the same. Cables are not the same length. So, I mean, it's an ideal and very hypothetical situation.
Yeah, what you mentioned is essentially what happens inside some module switches.
Yeah, exactly. Because
some of them
when you're within the switch, you know
variable
exactly.
size cells, and it's essentially what's happening inside. It's very well controlled environment, and latency is well bounded, and so on. Then you can make that work. So yeah, as I mentioned, there are global and local adaptive routing. And local adaptive routing is a decent starting point, but it's not nearly enough. And another important thing is that global adaptive routing is always reactive. In any interesting, like large enough network, it's going to be reactive because state changes very quickly on the order of few round trip times. So that means over like 100 of microseconds, you can have state change, and we usually have tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands links with multiple queues per link. So essentially, there is no way to distribute that queuing state fast enough to have up-to-date information at every node. And that means we cannot do proactive global adaptive routing. We're always going to do reactive. And in something like InfiniBand, we have things like adaptive routing notification, where a node where congestion happened can send notification packet back to the origin and to trigger flow movement to some other path. In IP, we don't have that. But in IP, we have.
Funny you said that. My first patent I filed in the early 90s was on fast notification packet to be used to change multicast flows.
Oh. Yeah. So yeah, but we are trying to make it work with what we have. What we have in IP is ECN and hopefully flow label, because everybody is using IPv6, hopefully.
Really?
We are, at least in the internal infrastructure. But one more reason to use it, actually. It's just very cheap, very nice way to change flow hashing without affecting source and destination socket bindings.
Unknown caller.
Yeah, so we can use ECN to detect, we are already using ECN to detect congestion, and we have flow label, and we can change flow label without changing the flow itself, and that hopefully will affect placement of that flow on the network. Problem with ECN is that it doesn't really provide information about the point where congestion happened, but still it's better than nothing.
So before you go, kind of important, I know we are running out of time. ECN works in a way that we all remember backend and backend in frame relay, right? That's exactly the same thing. In forward direction, you would mark a packet that is eligible. Receiver will see the packet and send notification to sender in commonly we call this packet CNP if we use DCQCN or like technology, that will notify the sender, look, there's a congestion or queue build up in the path, change entropy, reduce transmit rate, so react on it. It takes at least an RTT to detect.
Yes, it's actually very confusing because forward ECN marking happens in IP header, and notification going back is usually in the transport header, because your transport protocol must be ECN aware, or something like CNP if you are using RDMA. Yeah, but it's quite confusing for people who are encountering the first time, because it's quite asymmetric. But still, if we have topology with a lot of paths and can do load balancing across them, we actually have two options how to react to ECN. We can change congestion control parameters. That's a normal reaction, but we can actually try to just shift this flow to another path. So change flow label, but don't change congestion control parameters, hoping that another path is better than current one. And statistically, if we are shifting flows from congested paths and they kind of accumulate on less congested paths, statistically, we are going to get some good traffic allocation.
Yeah, so Google has very detailed description of this and a product called Flowbender that uses exactly that.
Yeah, And Google once again described it. It's SICOM last year. Same thing, they're using it, but they're using it with their own transport. But I don't see big problems with implementing that for TCP, for example. Of course, it's a tweak for congestion control mechanism, and it's probably going to raise a lot of angry voices at IETF. But it's a good mechanism, suitable for some environments. Not going to force it upon everybody, but there are some very good use cases. One important thing is that usually we want to wait. If you are going to shift flow to another path, we probably want to wait for a gap between consequent packets, so there's no reordering, or even maybe introduce that gap. Because, well, with latencies in typical data centers, round trip time less than 10 microseconds probably, it's not a very big gap.
And if you look at typical UDP heavy environment, you've got 16 bit of UDP source ports that could be used to change entropy.
Yeah. That it's a question how you bind it on both ends of connection. So you don't want to change binding, but otherwise, yeah, you have enough entropy, so it's possible to do that with in IPv4 environment as well. If you have enough headers, enough space in headers, you can safely tweak. So yeah, we kind of have minimal viable set of mechanisms to make it work. There are a lot of open questions, of course. And if you are talking about IETF, it's a cross-group work because like routing is routing, but adaptive routing is actually not something routing working group is going to consider probably, and it interacts with congestion control, so it's definitely going to involve people from with different interests from in different groups, and it's probably a good opportunity for cross group work, and it's definitely something interesting to make work.
Yeah, so IETF points, there is new working group that's going to work dedicated on congestion control. So it forked out of transport working group and was kind of chartered in last couple of months. This work is very related to congestion control in general. And I think I mentioned a couple of times our work on HPCC, which is high precision congestion control. There's a number of similar technologies evolving in different bodies. Practically, what it allows you to do is to gather much more information than just ECN bit marking about conditions of the network, which again in Dragonfly topologies will allow you to adaptively route over different paths.
Yeah, and you probably can make a decision much earlier.
Yeah.
And also, I would like to add that actually routing and adaptive routing are kind of complementary mechanisms. They work on different time scales because routing is probably going to work on the order of seconds, at best hundreds of milliseconds, and it affects forwarding states. It discovers topology. Adaptive routing doesn't change forwarding state. It doesn't need extra information about topology, and it works on the level of individual flows, and it works on the time scales of hundreds of microseconds.
So we always say distribute what you can, centralize what you must, and this is the approach.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions here. So why Dragonfly didn't become as popular as Claw, and what kind of scenarios application? So I'll answer the first one quickly. You've seen the complexity, right? It's not just the routing, it's proper binding from FAC to forwarding path.
Yeah.
It's not only the shortest path, it's also less loaded. There's a number of characteristics you need to know to utilize non-shortest path. It's really complex. It's still complex. What we are describing here is, I mean, I wouldn't call it naive. It's working, but it's definitely not complete to address all the requirements. So that's really trade-offs of Claw is equidistant, simple. We know exactly what it does. Dragonfly is not so simple. So
Yeah, dealing with that level of complexity is worth it when you're dealing with really large networks. And if you're talking about data center networks, they're growing larger and larger. So once again, more interest in making them more efficient and so on. And another thing is that with link speeds going up, optics, especially optics for long links, is starting to totally dominate cost of data center network. And there is a big motivation to reduce number of long links.
And with that, knowing that we actually today, normally we just go until we hit a stopping point, but today we've got kind of a hard stop at the top of the hour due to some meeting requirements. So this is probably a good place to stop for today.
yeah. I would like to thank Dima for joining us.
Yes,
and
thank you so much.
This
Thanks
is
for
not
inviting
kind
me.
of a self-contained meeting. It's just the first meeting in long series of meetings on the topic. We know that networking in data center has been focus of the show all the way along, but now with requirements coming from machine learning world, suddenly it gets order of magnitude more interest and really money and investment, right? This is where what people are building today. So we'll continue talking on the topic for a very long time. Thanks, Dima. Thanks, Jeff.
Dima.
Thanks.
Good to see everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.